Hello, everyone, and welcome to this panel, Read, Reflect, React. My name is Andrienne Cruz from Azusa City Library in Azusa, California, and I'll be moderating this session. This panel features a variety of discussable book club selections tackling grief, regret, obsession, as well as hope and redemption. Let's welcome the literary minds who will be sharing their insights and experiences with us today. First, we have Lily Brooks-Dalton. She is the author of Ruins, which will be published by Grand Central Publishing this coming March. Ruins is a women's fiction book about a female professor and archaeologist, Ember Agni, who becomes desperate to secure funding surrounding a mysterious artifact, an obsession that has put a strain on her marriage and her personal life. Next, we have Debra Curtis. Loss of Love and Logic is her first novel, and it will be published by Ballantine Books in February. Laws of Love and Logic is a sweeping women's fiction that spans 3 decades, told from the perspective of Lily Webb, whose life is forever changed after a terrible incident in high school that changed the trajectory of her life and separated her from her first true love. Terah Shelton Harris is the author of Where the Wildflowers Grow. It's her 3rd book, and it will be out in February, published by Sourcebooks Landmark. Where the Wildflowers Grow is about Leandra Wiles, a young Black woman who finds herself stranded among kind-hearted strangers and catches the eye of an attractive owner of a flower garden in a small Alabama town. Next, we have My Nguyen. Cleo Dang Would Rather Be Dead is her 2nd book, and it will be out in April, published by Atria Books. Cleo Dang Would Rather Be Dead is a darkly humorous literary fiction about a woman who lost her full-term baby in childbirth and decides to work on her grief by working at a funeral home. And last but not least, we have Anne Packer. Some Bright Nowhere is her 6th novel, and it will be published next month by Harper. Some Bright Nowhere is a character-driven novel about a husband grappling with the painful request of his cancer-stricken wife that unravels his sense of self and exposes elusive truths of devotion during a time of great despair. Okay, let's get started. I will ask each author a question, starting with Lily, followed by Debra, then Terah, Mai, and Anne. So, first question, Lily. What draws you to speculative fiction, and how does it allow you to explore themes that feel particularly urgent in our world today?
Thank you, Andrienne. That is a really good question to start with. For me, I think that speculative fiction can often get at a truth that realism can't quite reach. Um, I think that there are ways in which kind of skewing reality a little bit can give us access to a layer of what is real that cannot be reached in just straight up realism. They always say fiction is stranger than fact. And I think by kind of bringing in that element of whether it's magic or science fiction or, whatever kind of twist you're playing with, I think there's something really interesting that can happen bouncing off of whatever's grounded in the narrative. So, yeah.
Thank you. Debra, after a 25-year career as a cultural anthropologist specializing in gender and sexuality at Salve Regina University, what sparked your transition to fiction, and how did your scholarly insights shape this intriguing tale?
Let me first acknowledge the librarians. I'm a firm believer that democracy is predicated on a well-educated general public, and librarians play a crucial role in that education process. So before I talk briefly about my transition from being an academic anthropologist, a sex anthropologist, to writing. I just wanted to remind folks what the book is about. Lily is a young woman who is coming of age in the 70s, and she meets this young boy who's a good boy. He loves poetry, he loves literature, and he's a superb athlete. And then one night, something devastating happens, and they're forced to separate, and Lily has to figure out if she can find love again. We also meet Lily's sister, Jane, who is iconoclastic and unruly and is defying social norms at every turn. And their relationship, the sisters, Jane and Lily's relationship, lasts for decades, and it's a bond that's unbreakable. So how I transitioned was I had been teaching and writing about sexual pleasure and sexual violence and gender studies for, over almost 30 years. And I think I got bored. And then I started writing Christmas letters, the kind you send out to your friends at Christmas. And I got some feedback. I got some really good feedback. So I thought, maybe I'll shift gears and write creative nonfiction. And then, of course, the way in which my anthropological training shaped my fiction is that, as an anthropologist, I understand that, humans are shaped by the cultural context from which they emerge. In developing characters like Lily and Jane, who were young women coming of age in the 70s, I had to ask, what were the cultural forces, the religious forces, and the economic factors that impacted their lives? And because it spans decades, I had to chart the changing societal norms and have them reflected in their lives. And then the other way in which my anthropological training is peppered throughout the book is that I have these sort of queer obsessions, quirky obsessions with different practices, what we would call radical alterity, like headhunting and forgiveness and time and cross-cultural understandings of time. And so that's peppered throughout the story. But thanks for the question.
Thank you. Terah, as a former collection development librarian, what ignited your passion for crafting upmarket fiction novels?
Let me unmute myself. Great question. So, as a librarian, as a collection development librarian especially, I spent so much time, connecting readers with books, with the stories that they needed. And those were the ones that spoke directly to their heart and that hit them at the right moment. And so as a collection development librarian, I saw firsthand how books can transform lives and connect readers and offer that comfort and help people feel a little less alone. But one of the things that they told me, because my patrons at my library, my goodness, they do not hold back on the gaps that they feel that's in publishing right now. And one of the things that they constantly told me was that they wanted more stories that kind of touched on the human condition and that spoke to these unknown circumstances and situations that happen to people every day that we don't talk enough about or we don't know enough about. And I realized as I was starting to move from being a freelance writer to writing novels that that's the stories that I wanted to tell. And so I was like, you know what, maybe I can fill that gap that they feel that is existing in publishing. And so, but my library background taught me that the readers are hungry for authentic emotion and characters who feel real and these narratives that kind of honor the messiness of being human, And that's what I try to recreate with my upmarket fiction is that these stories that sit with you long after you close the book.
Wonderful. The author's note at the end of your novel offers a poignant glimpse into the personal spark that ignited the story. Can you expand on that intimate revelation?
Yeah, so I went back and forth on whether I should include an author's note with this book. Not every book does that, not every author does that. And I don't think authors necessarily are compelled or have to include an author's note to explain why they wrote this book or what inspiration they gleaned from writing this book. But because, just to remind everyone, my book Cleo Dang Would Rather Be Dead is about a grieving mother who has just lost her baby from unexpected labor complications, and she is in the thick of grief and she's coping in very unhealthy ways. She's rotting in bed, she's ignoring all of her calls, she decides to take up a job at a funeral home despite all of her family's and husband's wishes. And it's a story that deals with the very acute phases of grief. She questions her existence. She pushes everyone away from her life. And I just thought that it felt important to me to share with the readers that this is an experience that I did not just come up from my imagination. It was an experience that I have personally gone through myself. 3 years ago, I lost my own baby from labor complications, and I felt compelled to share that with the reader at the end of the book, because I know myself as a reader, when I really love a book and I read a book, I want to know how this author knows so much about the topic. Most of the times, it's just really good research. Some of the times, it's something from their own personal life. And I feel such a privilege when I get to know that information from the author, whether they feel compelled to share it or not. It is definitely their decision whether they want to. But for me, I thought it was felt right to share that this book is heavily inspired by my own experiences, whether in hopes it might forge a kind of trust and credibility with the reader. And I just thought if I put that out there, that anybody else who is going through similar experiences of grief and loss, that they know that this story was handled with a lot of care, and that they know that they have a kindred spirit among them when they read the book. So that's why I made quite a last minute decision to add a little brief note at the end of the book.
Oh, thank you. Anne, your portrayal of the hurt spouse perspective feels so raw and nuanced. What books, movies, or characters shape that lens for you? And I have to say, I keep imagining an older Adam Driver in the role of Elliot. Does that resonate?
Oh, great question. Adam Driver's too tall. I mean, I think that's such a weird comment, but it just goes to how much we picture our characters as we're writing, even if we don't put physical descriptions into the text that much. And, I grandiosely really have been picturing Tom Hanks, to tell you the truth. In terms of inspiration, I think rather than sort of books, movies, characters, etc., I had a strange, utterly unemotional, unlike Mai's experience of actually hearing about a situation that intrigued me so much, I ended up having to write a novel about it. And the situation was that a man's wife had reached the end of her life, and her friends decided that he just wasn't up to the task of taking care of her. And so they took his place. They just moved in and he moved out. And I understood so much that idea of, let's women taking care of women. It's sort of the historical way. But I also thought, well, that the historical way kind of doesn't leave room for a man who wants to do it. And my character wants to do it, and he's sort of pushed away in a loving way. It's not mean, but he has to grapple um, with, as you said in your intro, what it means about himself and his marriage.
Thank you. Lily, in what ways do Amber's archaeological quests symbolize broader human drives?
So Ember is, an incredibly ambitious character. She's at times really unlikable. And that was like a really important part of the book to me, is to create this woman who is really difficult. Like I hear women being described as difficult so much. And it's often strikes me as really unfair. When we see a woman with so much ambition and so much fidelity to what she's passionate about, she's immediately difficult. So I think her quest, which is the engine of her ambition, to me is kind of what I wanted to do is see if I could take all the sort of questionable drives of humans as a group, and see what they would look like superimposed onto one individual person. And so, yeah, that's kind of something that I was playing with, this sort of allegorical idea of like, what is, what are these darker tones of humanity look like in their quest to discover and to expand, to learn more about where we live and how we live. What would that look like on just one woman? So yeah, I think her quest to sort of go deeper and deeper into this landscape. It's so hard to talk about this book without kind of ruining the first twist. I need to get better at this. But when we meet Ember, she is kind of locked in academia. She's in a really unsatisfying straight marriage. And as the book progresses, these sort of limitations of her surroundings, her marriage, her job sort of fall away, and she starts to expand into a more queer and wilderness-based reality.
Thank you. Deborah, the novel immerses us in the Catholic world of a small town during Lily's formative years as a revival of traditional Catholicism gains traction among younger generations and pockets across the United States. What are your thoughts on this movement, and how does it echo or contrast with the faith's role in your characters' lives?
Wow. Your questions are amazing. Okay. Let me. So, as many of you might know, in terms of, I'm not going to get into the history of modern Catholicism, but I will say that there is a split, and it's probably much more complicated than we have time to talk about. There's a split within the Catholic Church between what we might call conservative Catholics and on one hand, and progressives on the other. And that split has a long history. If we just go back to the 1960s, to Vatican, the Vatican II movement, Second Vatican, we see that the conservatives are looking for moral certainty, moral authority to their eternal truths. What happens in the 60s is that with Vatican II, we have a progressive focus on preferential treatment to the poor. And we call that the Catholic social teachings. And what is emphasized is the role of Catholics is to take care of people who are economically marginalized, the sick, prisoners, and folks who are in need. So I'm 62, and the school that I taught at was the only university I ever taught at. I got my PhD from Rutgers. But I wanted a job in Rhode Island, where I'm from. So I came back to Rhode Island. I got the only job on the island as an anthropologist. And for decades, in faculty meetings, this split would manifest itself in hot debates about the curriculum, about what the curriculum was going to look like and what was our role as a Catholic institution. And as a 62-year-old feminist who came of age in the 70s, I couldn't keep my mouth shut. And I was very vocal about getting this idea of preferential treatment for the poor in the curriculum, in biology classes, in history classes, in politics classes, in philosophy classes. And there was a lot of pushback. I know you guys know this, but I'm always surprised at who wages wars against the poor. And when it's fellow Catholics, it's still kind of shocking to me. So all of that anger that I had and that confusion about the role of the feminist Catholic comes out in the novel. It comes out in the form of the protagonist, Lily, and her sister Jane's mother. And she's a 60s Catholic living at a monastery, at a private boarding school, living at a monastery on the grounds of a monastery run by the Benedictines. And all of her focus about what it means to be a Catholic woman and serve others is transmitted through to her daughters. And then in the real world, I live at that same monastery. I live on the grounds of the Portsmouth Abbey, which used to be called the Portsmouth Priory, run by Benedictines. And I'm a flaming feminist, and I had these unlikely friendships with these old monks that I would meet on my nightly walks. And while we were very different in terms of our focus and our priorities, I found a lot of commonalities with these old dudes. And that comes through in the book as well. As a former scholar, I guess I'm still a scholar. As a former academic, I'm not prepared to comment on the current rise of revival Catholicism among the youth.
All right. I'll go to Terah. Your portrayal of the farm residents as a found family feels so lived in and healing. What personal or literary inspirations helped you capture that quiet, transformative solidarity?
That's a good question. Before I answer that, let me just give the audience a little quick brief of what A Wildflowers Grow is about. It's about an escaped convicted felon who addresses and unpacks her trauma, her childhood trauma on a flower farm in rural Alabama. And so the found family that she's speaking about is the family that accepts and welcomes her because she is escaping and running from the law. But I think it's more of a personal thing for me. I am personally drawn to stories about people who can find family and build family from the wreckage of whatever lives that, they've had. And I think there's just something really beautiful and profound about strangers choosing each other and creating this home, not from blood, but just from like these shared experiences. And so on the flower farm, you have Jackson, who's the hunky flower farmer, and you have Tib and you have Luke. And Lee comes to discover that they've all had and survived their own traumas. But when she arrives there, of course, she's combative, but they just accept her for who she is. They don't ask that she needs to be healed, from the things that have broken her. They ask her to stay. And that kind of acceptance of being seen in your brokenness and being loved anyway is what I feel like true healing and what it really looks like. And I also want to show how community can hold space for our pain without trying to rush us through it. So she was able to heal from a community of people. And so, they don't have all the answers to the things that she's dealing with, but they show up for her and they're patient with her and they're kind, and tender to her. And sometimes that's enough to help a person believe that they deserve something good. And so I wanted to add that, that extra little part of the found family to the story.
Thank you so much. Cleo's relentless question: what happens after we die? Echoes through her conversations with everyone from friends to strangers. Does this mirror any of your own lingering curiosities about the afterlife? And how has your relationship with religion or spirituality shaped the way you explore these existential questions in your writing?
Thanks so much for that question. Thanks for going there. I know a lot of people struggle to talk about death or ask questions about death because we don't want to talk about it at all. It's a very uncomfortable subject. And despite writing a book about a character who goes on a journey, a spiritual and physical journey, to discover what happens after we die, spoiler alert, I don't know. The book has no answers for you really, because we all come to those conclusions on our own, based on our own experiences, based on our relationship with religion and spirituality. And I think it's just a very natural process to question what happens after we die, particularly after experiencing a personal loss. I'll be honest, I had never ever thought about the afterlife until I had experienced loss, because I was privileged enough not to ever have to think about it. And so I thought it would be a very interesting project to have this character go through this journey where she's asking family, friends, complete strangers, what happens after we die, and getting completely different answers one after the other. She even goes on the internet for answers too. She's quite a bit of a science nerd, so she discovers that there was this study that was done by scientists. It was a real study where the scientists placed a little blue tower inside a rat's box. And every time that rat encountered that blue tower, there were certain neurons that would fire from the rat's brain. And so then one day, maybe after 4 or 5 days, the scientists removed the tower from the box, and they discovered that the neurons in that brain was still continuing to fire, despite the fact that the blue tower was gone. So I think it was suggesting the fact that even after someone we love dies, our brain is still searching for that person. It has not accepted the fact that this person is gone. It thinks the person is somewhere else. In the book, like I talk about how you can literally see a body being lowered to the ground and still wonder what that person's up to this weekend, because your brain just cannot compute for several days, several weeks, maybe even several months that that person is gone. And so I think, yeah, these are just questions that happens when someone we love dies, and it's our brain's way of coping with the aftermath. As someone myself who is not personally religious, and Cleo, my protagonist, is not a religious person, I think she had to do a lot more work to come up with her own conclusions into the afterlife. She couldn't rely on a set of beliefs provided to her by way of religion, as in, she couldn't just accept the fact that her baby was in heaven, because that was not a belief system she grew up with. She couldn't accept that her baby had been reincarnated, because that was not a belief system she grew up with. So she had to go searching for her own conclusions. And I kept that journey pretty open-ended in the book.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Anne, suffering has a way of pulling us inward and isolating us from those closest to us. What does Eliot's response reveal about the true nature of supportive relationships?
So I think one of the linchpins of my novel, and I don't want to give the plot away, so I'm going to be a little bit vague, is the question of how much anticipatory grief is a private matter versus something that occupies us in community. And I think for Eliot, the answer is sort of, it's something that he's struggling with all along, but he doesn't really know it. I always like to distinguish between what's conscious for the characters and what's unconscious and becoming conscious as the story unfolds. And I think that for this book, that's really sort of the crux of the matter for Eliot.
Thank you. Lily, you already mentioned something about Ember. So let's go back to that one. So she's a really richly layered character, flawed, ambitious, not always easy to champion. Can you share more about that backstory and her motivations, and which facet of her personality do you hope readers will come to appreciate most deeply?
Yeah, so you know, ruin the for me the title is such a key to the book. Ruins is a multivalent. It's a verb, it's a noun. And so the book is really interested in unpacking all those layers of what ruins means. And so part of that is the ruin that Ember is making of her own life. um, and the ways in which she is actively ruining the relationships around her that are important to her, that are feeding her. And we do meet her mother through some memories and start to understand a little more about, like, how does this kind of happen to a person that they're so unconsciously um, committed to pushing the people that are important to them away, um, in service of an ambition that isn't necessarily going to feed her in the same way that like a human relationship would. Um, but I think for me, the linchpin of Ember as a character is this, like, initially her quest is for an artifact, right? It's for this lost civilization. But as the book unfolds, it becomes clear to the reader and clear to her that the quest is in fact for belonging. And she spent this whole narrative kind of coming up against the edges of all these structures that she doesn't belong in, that don't fit her, that she is trying so hard to um, to make work, and they just keep falling apart around her and crumbling. And so I think that piece of her character, this quest for belonging and finding the environment, the relationship, the situation that will finally bring her peace, that's kind of, yeah, the bottom line for me.
That's really helpful, actually. Now that you mentioned it, it really helps to kind of put that layer on your book. Debra, so Lily grapples with a visceral wave of guilt throughout her story. Does it carry the weight of that distinctly Catholic kind, shaped by upbringing, or how do the nuances between secular and religious guilt shape her path?
I know you've heard this several times today. Your questions are so intense and so insightful. The theme of guilt is a big theme, and it's distinctively Catholic. And I'm not a psychologist, but I think I can say that the kind of guilt that I wrote about is distinctively Catholic, because when Lily considers what her own failings in her own mind, it's not that she just failed herself or failed another person. In Lily's mind, she failed God. And so I think the biggest difference between Catholic guilt and secular guilt, non-Catholic guilt, is that there's a moral, there's this larger theological connection that Catholics make. It's also, Catholic guilt is so interesting, and I'm sure that there's so many theologians that could speak more eloquently than I ever could about it, but there's something about Catholic guilt in family. It almost feels hereditary. And by hereditary, I don't necessarily mean encoded into our DNA, because as an anthropologist, I reject that. But it's like a cultural memory. It's like a collective cultural memory that gets sewn into our bones. And it's so powerful, even if you leave the church and you're a recovering Catholic, So that's really all I can say about that. But I'm definitely gonna think more about it. I have to, right?
It it's a beautiful statement that you made, actually. So thank you. Terah, your novel navigates mental illness and childhood trauma with such tender insight. How do you envision these threads touching readers, perhaps offering solace or a new lens on their own
Hmm.
stories?
Hmm.
Yeah, Deborah, I'm with you. These are such amazing questions. Goodness gracious. And there is definitely a theme of guilt and grief within these books I see. But I think my hope is that readers that have similar wounds to what Lee has experienced can see themselves in her journey and feel a little less alone. Trauma is not resolved neatly, and I wanted to honor that truth. And her survivor's guilt, her complicated her complicated grief and her struggle to distinguish between surviving and living are all very real experiences that I wanted to put down on the page. But I also wanted to show the multiple paths that a person can take to healing. I live in rural Alabama, and for the experiences and the trauma that she faces, it'd be easy to tell someone to go to therapy, but it is just not possible. Therapy is not available in some areas, in some places. And so the guys used a lot of nature to help her heal. So I wanted to show that. I want to show that, through yoga with Tib and grounding exercises with Jackson and just, literally touching grass. I know we say that now as a joke, but literally touching grass, how healing that nature can truly be. And because healing is not a one size fits all by any means, and it doesn't happen on anyone's timeline either. I think that's the biggest question or the biggest thing that I wanted to show, that it takes time to heal. And I think if readers take away anything, I hope it's something that I wrote in the author's note, which is you are more than what you have survived, and your worth is not defined by your trauma and the battles that you fought. And that it's never too late to realize that you've just been surviving your life and not really truly living it, and that transformation is always possible, even when it feels impossible.
Terah, your book feels like a warm hug.
Oh, thank you.
You handle grief with such raw delicacy, blending humor and heartache in Cleo's world at the funeral home. What were the most surprising or transformative discoveries from your research on how people approach and process grief that found their way into the story?
Yeah, I think I discovered a lot of things as I was writing this book. Um, I discovered that grief is not linear. There's not a finish line. There's not an end of the tunnel or an other side, whatever, insert whatever metaphor you want there. You could be okay one day and not okay another day. You could be, belly laughing in the morning and then bawling your eyes out at night that very same day. And that is present in my book. And I think that was a difficult thing to do with the book, because you sort of want to see some sort of progression with your character. You want to see them change by the end. But I was really adamant that my character not go from the depths of hell to suddenly frolicking on a beach, happy as ever by the end of it. And I think that is a tendency that authors lean towards, because it's such a proven, successful um, way to plot out your book. But I thought that would not be truthful to the real raw process of grief, which is that there's no end date, and so I I wanted to show a character that was constantly up and down, and I think readers could probably be really frustrated by that, because you want to have a protagonist that gets to the end, like that sees the happy light. But I refuse to make it so clear cut and clean by the end. My protagonist, she spends a lot of time trying to hide how badly she's hurting, pretending she's fine all the time. But ultimately, she realizes that that wasn't helping at all, and that what actually helps is letting people in and showing them how much you're hurting. And one thing I learned is that grieving people who are in pain, all they really want is for their pain to be seen, to be witnessed, to be acknowledged. And the first step in allowing that to happen is for you to share that pain and share your story. There's a saying in Vietnamese called "chia buồn," which means to divide up the sadness, so that when you share your grief and your story with others, then you're essentially giving everybody a piece of your pie, a piece of your grief pie or your pain pie, whatever it is, so that not one person, not you, you're not carrying the burden alone. And so it's a saying that I really stuck onto and included in the book, and that's partly why I set the book in a funeral home. I think funerals are just as much for the living as they are for the dead. I think it is the one time where we can see people suffering on display. And it was just I thought it was just an interesting setting to have her grief be on show.
Thank you. I will have to remember that saying. Maybe I won't be able to say it, but I will remember the what's behind it. Thank you. And writers often have those tantalizing what if moments from the cutting room floor. So, without giving anything away, is there a discarded arc or transition from some bright nowhere that still lingers with you, and why? And I think you're muted. And
Oh, whoops. Okay. Let's see. Starting over. Great question. I'll be quicker about it than I was. There's I started this book. Let me back up a little bit and say that Elliot, the husband, is off to one side, and his wife Claire is in their home preparing to die and being cared for by her two close friends, Holly and Michelle. And the thing that changed for me in the writing of the book is that when I first started out, I thought it would be a book that had all four points of view. And in fact, I started writing in the point of view of the woman who was dying. And I wrote, a chapter in her point of view. I started a chapter in the point of view of one of her friends. I thought I would continue with that, go to the other friend, and finally finish with the husband when they'd gotten, much closer to the very sad inevitable. And I couldn't get it activated really. I wasn't happy with it. I felt like I knew the women more than I wanted to write about them. And that the hard thing would be to get into the husband's point of view and to have to really process the feelings of rejection and disappointment that would be part of his experience, in addition to all of the love and memories about this long marriage. So after setting it aside for a while, I started over and I wrote it entirely from the husband's point of view, and it really fell into place at that point. In fact, it went faster than I've ever written a draft of a novel. I did the first draft of this book in like 4 months, which has, for context, it took me 10 years to write my first book. Um, so that's what's there on the floor, is this sort of false start of being more including all the characters' points of view rather than really focusing on this man and his marriage, and his children are characters, and they're just following this timeline that's completely inevitable and can't be altered in any way.
thank you. So guys, if you have any questions for our speakers, please put them in the Q&A now. We'll see if we have time. I still have a lot of questions, so we'll see. Um, for Lily, how does the narrative critique or eliminate the perils of unchecked ambition? And what real world parallels do you see in Ember's journey?
Yeah, I mean, so many real world parallels. Name any like white man European explorer, and you've got like a pretty good echo. Um, yeah, I think the thing that really drove the book for me is this idea of our place in history, and how we see ourselves, how we see the past, how we think about the future. Um, I think in our current time period, we have this changing right now, but I think we've had this idea of ourselves as ascending, right? And like every most recent moment is its own pinnacle. We're just going up. All of our tech is getting better. Our civilizations are getting more advanced. And yet, I think that we are actually experiencing a real collective re-examination of that. I think there is a pretty pervasive sense of dread and fear of decline that, in fact, we're maybe, I think it's both. It's like we've got AI and we're like skyrocketing, and, maybe the cars will fly soon. But at the same time, there's this real sense of collective doom that I think people feel. And I think people ascribe it to different things, but I think it truly is expansive. And so I hope that's not too much of a tangent, but like the book, I think, is really interested in this idea of what is advancement, what is primitiveness, what does it mean for civilization to ebb and flow and decline and ascend. And those are really, without giving away the twist, those are really the questions that the narrative and that Ember is wrestling with.
All right. So I think we have like 3 minutes. So it might be Deborah will be the last question. I really have a lot more, but we don't have any more time. So Deborah, Lily's first love, a pivotal figure in her youth, remains unnamed. What drove this deliberate artistic decision, and how does it deepen the reader's emotional connection to her unresolved longing and loss?
Wow. I have no idea. But I will say that I have no business writing a sentence, let alone a novel. And the creative process is not easy for me to talk about, but I do know one thing for sure, and that's that this was not a deliberate artistic decision. As you mentioned, the boy goes unnamed. Everyone else has a name. And even when the boy is a grown man in his late 40s, he's still the boy. So I learned as a beginner writer that sometimes, the writer doesn't make the decision. And that doesn't mean my editor or my agent made it either. It just means the decision was already made. And I just had to follow through with that decision. And the idea that that would have an effect on readers never occurred to me, I swear to God, until I read your questions. But now I know that it might, and perhaps it'll leave him mythic.
Mhm.
Perhaps it'll speak to the reader's own question about whether or not you can have more than one great love in your life.
Mhm.
That's really the book. The nature of the book is whether or not you can have more than one great love in your life, and what is the meaning of radical forgiveness in our lives. And so he remains unnamed because he's that presence that speaks to both the many forms love takes and the nature of forgiveness in a society.
Wonderful. So I think our time is up. A big thank you to our speakers and the librarians who continue to champion the joy of reading and thoughtful discussion. Next, we have 2 concurrent panels, First Impressions and Say the Magic Word. Have a wonderful day, guys, and happy
Thank
reading.
you. Thank you.